Good barely afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to have you at the Discovery IPC Grand Rounds and to introduce my colleague, Lynn Perry. Lynn is an expert on young children's vocabulary development. She earned her bachelor's at Indiana University, her doctorate at the University of Iowa in developmental psychology, we're psychologists, and completed her postdoctoral studies at the University of Wisconsin in cognitive neuroscience. In 2015, after more than a decade of doing research at these three Big Ten universities in the upper Midwest, she made her way to sunny Florida, and she joined our faculty at UM as an assistant professor of psychology. Lynn's work is focused on language development, and in particular on word learning. It is highly innovative. She's going to present one topic here. She has about two more in the bag that are equally interesting and stimulating. It's a real treat to have her as a colleague. And today she'll be talking about language learning going on across the street, really across the walkway at the Debbie School. Won't you join me in welcoming Lynn Perry?
Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to share some of the work I've been doing at the Debbie School and also work at Linda Ray Intervention Center. I'm going to tell about both schools. So the starting place for this work is this very rich body of literature where people have found that the speech that caregivers share with young children has long-term cascading consequences for children's language development. So for example, we know that the number of words that caregivers share with their young children are associated with positive gains in language development. We also know it's not just the number of words that children hear that matter for their language development, but how those words are used. So talk from parents that encourages conversation is associated with better outcomes. So these are WH questions, getting the child to expand on the topic of conversation rather than directive language or command type language. So encouraging the child to talk and share. Okay. But even though we know that parent speech has really important consequences for children's development, we don't know that much about speech in child care settings and the role that teachers and peers can play in children's development. And this is an important issue to explore because so many children spend a large part of their week in early child care centers. So on average, kids who attend some sort of external child care do so for about 36 hours a week. So that's a lot of experience that hasn't really been characterized and is important to understand to see contributions to their language development. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about studies that we've done in two schools, the Linda Ray Intervention Center and the Debbie School, to try to understand language experiences in the classroom. Okay. And so the first study, what we're doing is examining the influence of teacher and peer language input on children's own language use and their long-term language development. And we're doing that at the Linda Ray Intervention Center. So this is interventions for children who are very low SES background and at risk for developmental delay. And we studied children in a toddler classroom between the ages of 2 and 3. Okay, so we measured their language experiences there. Children are referred to the program because of developmental risk factors and low SES. So the particular classroom that we studied, the children started when they're 2 years old. There's 13 of them. They're all monolingual English speakers, primarily Black or African American, and they were all, at the beginning of our study, fairly delayed in their expressive vocabulary. So based on the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Developmental Inventory, all but one of the children were below the 10th percentile for their age and vocabulary, and the remaining child was at the 30th percentile, so still fairly behind. And they're also behind based on the Battelle Developmental Inventory. Okay, So the way that we studied language experiences in the classroom was using an automated measure called the Lina system. The Lina is a recorder that the child can wear in a vest or a t-shirt. So it just goes right here. It's very lightweight. The kids like wearing the vests. They don't really mess with it or even notice that the recorder is there. And then it just records the audio environment over the course of the day. And then this Lina is associated with software where we upload the recording and it can characterize the audio environment. So it makes an estimate of whether audio that was recorded was words that the child wearing the recorder said, or words that another child who's a little bit farther away from the recorder might have said, or words that a teacher or an adult might have said. And it also provides us with a measure of the number of conversational turns that the child wearing the recorder and adults are engaging in. So that gives us an estimate of the quantity of language experiences that they have with adults as well. Okay, so in this year-long study, we're going to look at those Lina codings of these different language experiences. So language input from the teachers, language input from each of the peers, and conversational turns with teachers. And we're going to do this at multiple time scales to understand the language environment and the role that in-the-moment experiences might have on long-term development. So we're going to study how language changes moment to moment in different sorts of actions and activities that the children might engage in. Over the course of the day, what sorts of language input are associated with children's language use. And over the course of the school year, what types of experiences are most positively associated with growth in language. Okay, so first, let's start by thinking about moment by moment. So in a preschool classroom, necessarily some activities involve more teacher talking and child listening. So highly structured activities might be characterized more by teacher talking and children not talking. Okay, but there's also all sorts of other more unstructured activities, like playing outside at recess, lunchtime, personal care type activities that are more unstructured, and so we might see more child talking and maybe less adult talking. And previous studies in the home looked at how the structure of different types of activity influenced adults' talk. And what was found in the home is that parents tend to talk more during very structured activities like shared book reading or organized play, and they talk less during unstructured activities, but children's speak doesn't change over the course of those. So in the context of the school, similar to previous studies at home, we see that structured activities are associated with large increases in adult talking. So during circle time, during shared book reading, teachers are talking a lot more than they are during more unstructured times, like recess. Okay, we also see increases in child speech and peer speech to the target child during those structured activities, although those increases aren't as large as you can see compared to how much teachers are increasing their talking. And then finally, there's an increase in the number of conversational turns that children engage in with their teachers during those structured activities. So shared book reading, circle time, that structure seems to be important for getting that back and forth conversation and drawing the child in to have very high quality type of interactions. Okay, talking, turn taking, all associated with these structured activities. So next, to better understand language experience in the classroom, we can ask how the amount of input that children receive from their teachers and peers, regardless of the activity context, relates to their language production, right? So across all these contexts, how does the amount of input that you're hearing from your teachers, the quality of that input, and the amount of input you hear from your peers relate to your own talking? Okay, so here we're looking at factors predicting children's own rate of talking. Okay, so this is all the talking recorded over a day, averaged by the length of time they spent in the classroom. Kids spend slightly different times in the classroom based on arrival and departure times, so we want to make it a rate rather than just a sum. So in both of these graphs, I'm going to be showing the number of vocalizations that the child wearing the recorder made and predicting that by here, the number of conversational turns that they're engaging in with teachers, and over there on the right, the number of vocalizations they heard from their peers. Okay, and so we see first, there's a very significant relationship with conversational turns and child vocalizations. And some of this is necessarily true within the context of a conversation. A conversation means that both the child and the adult are talking, but this is averaged across the total day, so it's not tied to any one specific conversation. You see that conversations are associated with increases in child talking. And same with peer vocalization. So the more input children are hearing from their peers, the more they tend to talk as well. So there's a strong positive relationship there between both conversational turns and input from peers. But interestingly, when we look just at the number of vocalizations children heard from their teachers, outside of the context of conversational turns, we found a negative relationship with their own talking. So when we account for teacher language that's in the context of a turn, what's left over is not as positive a predictor of children's own language use. And that could be that that's the talk that's occurring in those contexts where it's the teacher talking, child listening. Okay. So then finally we wanted to look, because we studied this classroom for a whole year, how did children's language development change over the course of the year? And here we measured language development using vocabulary development as the measure with the MacArthur-Bates. And we measured at 3 time points, so 1 month before we started the study, 6 months into it, and then 1 month after the study to look at changes in the rate of acquisition and how those were associated with language experiences. Okay, and what we found, so again here we're looking at the role of conversational turns, or that very high quality input with teachers, and the role of peer vocalizations. They both had a significant positive relationship in predicting vocabulary over the course of the year. So here we're plotting vocabulary growth by changes in vocabulary per day. Okay, so if you're up here, that means you're learning 1 new word per day on average. And the more conversational turns you engage in over the course of that year, the more your vocabulary is growing. The more peer vocalizations you heard over that year, the more your vocabulary is growing. So those are both predictors of the rate of vocabulary development. And similar to our analysis of children's talking, we found that adult talking, not in the context of conversational turns, was negatively associated with vocabulary development. So children who are hearing a lot of input from adults but aren't engaging in back and forth conversational turns with those adults are not growing as much in their vocabulary knowledge. Okay. So an interim summary from the work that we did at Linda Ray, it seems that conversational turn taking with teachers and input from peers are both positively associated with language use and development over these multiple time scales. So over the course of the day, over the course of a year. And input from adults that's not in the context of conversation is negatively associated with language use and development. So after this finding, we became really interested in the input from peers part. This is a really understudied contribution to children's language development in the field. We wanted to understand that further. And a remaining question from the work at Linda Ray was that we were unable to assess which particular peers children interacted with. We had the audio recorder characterizing that the language they're hearing came from a child, but we didn't know which child and who they were interacting with more, and whether some sorts of input from certain kids might matter more. So we want to know how do interactions with specific peers influence language use and language outcome. And I think this type of work is going to have really important implications for questions related to inclusivity and special education. Thinking about children with language delays or communication disorders, is it beneficial to have a peer model there without a communication disorder? Is it better for the child to talk to someone who's a little bit more advanced, someone who's more at their own ability? How do we structure classrooms to have the most positive gains for everybody? So that brings us to study 2, where we're beginning to do just that, to try to understand which specific peers children are talking to. And the particular data I'm going to show you come from our observation of a classroom at the Debbie School last spring. We've continued doing this work at the Debbie School and also now at Linda Ray, where we're looking at which specific peers kids talk to. So we measure the language experiences in these classrooms in the same way that we did in the first study using Lina to measure and track language, but now we're adding an additional automated measure. This is called UbiSense, and it's going to track children's movements in the classroom. Okay, so the way this works is in the classroom there's sensors located in each of the 4 corners, and each child wears 2 tags that we've put into the vest that have the Lina. And they have 2 tags so that we can know, as the signals bounce off these sensors, where they are in the room. And they have 2 of them so we can tell which direction they're facing to. So we know where they are, which way they're oriented. Okay, so we're going to combine our measurement of children's movement through space with our measurement of when they're talking so that we can know who they're talking to. And we did this in an inclusive oral language classroom for children with hearing loss who use hearing aids or cochlear implants, and did this over the course of 10 weeks, once a week. And in this classroom, there are 10 children, 7 of them had hearing loss and 3 had typical hearing. Okay, so first I'm going to show you just a small snippet. This is a movie based on what we recorded. What you'll see, there'll be different people coming in and out of the room. The green are teachers, blue is children with hearing loss, red is children with typical hearing. So on this day, 2 of the kids with typical hearing were absent. But you can see as they move around the room, this is sped up quite a bit. So this is the 10-minute segment sped up to be 20 seconds, so it's pretty fast. But you'll see as they move around, and what will happen is as somebody starts to vocalize, they'll get a black outline around them. Okay. So you can see as they're moving around and as people are talking, and how the children are talking to each other, the teachers.
That's sped up
Super
at all.
there. Okay, so that gives us just a brief snapshot of what can happen, and we can also look at it here. So here we've also, in this figure, just one snapshot in time, incorporated the orientation information. So we've turned children into triangles here so that the circle in the front represents their face. So we know which way they're facing based on that orientation information, so that we can know this child is facing this other child's back while they're talking to them, but they're pretty close, and so on. Okay, and then we use all that information about distances to come up with a criterion for ourselves about how close can kids be before we decide that they're probably in an interaction with each other. So across all those 10 weeks, we measured how far apart over the course of the whole day did different individuals tend to be. And here we're plotting how far apart in meters all those different children were. And what we find is that at about 1.5 meters, there's more interactions that are that far apart than we'd expect on chance. So we've set our cutoff for interactions that we want to look at 1.5 meters. After that, it seems more random. There's fewer like that. So it seems that 1.5 meters represents when social contact might be happening. Okay. So then we can start to, once we have our cutoff about we want to look at interactions that are happening within 1.5 meters, we can start to characterize who children are interacting with. Okay, so here this is just a plot based on one day of who children tended to interact with most and how much they tended to vocalize during those interactions. So here, the width of these edges, I don't know if you can see the differences too well, but this one, for example, is thicker than those two. The width of those edges is proportional to the number of social contacts each child had with the other child. So this child had a lot more with that child than this thinner edge right there. And then the size of the node is proportional to the amount of talking that the child did in social contact. So here, this is just one particular day. It looks like it's a different day from the video I showed you. The white circles, these are two typically hearing children. They talked a lot more than the children with hearing loss, as you can see from this. And they were more, this child at least, was more tied to many other children. So they're having a lot of interactions there. But this is just a glimpse over the course of one day. We also looked, based on the number of social contacts that children had, how much language was being shared in social contact. So how the language you hear from each of your peers when you're 1.5 meters away and oriented towards them, how that predicts the language that you use the next time. Okay, so I got some input today. What am I going to do the next time we record based on how much my friends talk to me? And we can look at that both with respect to the amount you talk to each of those same friends the next week to see how those partnered conversations continue over time. And we can also look at it based on how much you talk in general. So the input you get from your friends changes you in a general way, even outside of the interactions you have with them. Okay, and so what we found here on the x-axis, I'm plotting the rate of peer vocalizations that the child heard from each of their peers on a given day, predicting the rate of vocalizations that they make to those same peers a week later when we record again. And so there's a very strong, positive, significant relationship between those two, even when we control for the amount that the target child was talking on the previous week. Okay, so this is time 1. We measure how much the peer talks to the child, how much the child talks to the peer, and use those to predict how much the child talks next week. And even controlling for how much the child talked on time 1, the child is going to talk more if they get more peer input. Okay? So the number of vocalizations a child hears from their peers today predicts how many vocalizations they produce next week, above and beyond what they spoke today. Okay? And that's true both in predicting their vocalizations to that specific peer next week, but also overall regardless of partner. Okay, so if your peers talk a lot to you today, you're going to talk a lot more than we'd expect next week given how much you talked in general today, regardless of who you talk to next week. So the summary from study 2 and our work in the Debbie School so far shows that input from peers is positively associated with children's future language use. The specific peers they talk to influence their future behavior. So it increases the talking that they do to those same peers, and that they talk more in general, regardless of to which peers. Okay, so we can start to ask why peer input should matter so much. Okay, so peer interactions are potentially important both for the language content that they provide and for the social content that they can provide. So interacting with a more advanced peer can provide a child with opportunities to hear new or unknown vocabulary or new or more complex grammatical constructions. And additionally, interacting with a peer can provide a child with opportunities to practice social interactions. So regardless of their or their peers' language abilities. Okay, so playing and interacting with peers can help children learn pro-social behaviors, to develop their own emotional regulation abilities, and given the proposed role for executive functions in both language and social development, it's going to be really important to future research to examine how peer interactions might scaffold those associations. And going back to the results from the first study where we also looked at input children got from their teachers, we saw that in addition to peer input, the number of conversational turns that children engaged with their teachers really mattered for their language use and their vocabulary development. Okay? So clearly the more turns that are taken, the more opportunities there are for the child to learn and to practice using language. And that should naturally lead to an increase in child talking. So the back and forth nature of turn taking allows for richer learning opportunities. So when an adult engages a child in conversation, it draws them in, increasing their attention to adults' words and to those meanings of those words, and lets them practice using language constructively. The attention that's going to be required to understand and respond to an adult in a conversation might scaffold the acquisition of new vocabulary or of more complex grammatical constructions. And interestingly, in past studies that looked at the quality of language, even in the classroom, what's typically done is a teacher is given a certain rating based on their general quality of input and compared to another teacher. And that rating is thought to capture how she interacts with the whole class. But what we saw is that input quality varies as a function of activity over the course of the school day, and it also varies as a function of individual dyad. And that variability matters for outcome. So children obviously in their language abilities contribute to the quality of a conversation. If a child can't talk or vocalize at all yet, we're not going to be able to record any conversations. So that contributes somewhat to the variability, but this helps identify that there's room for improvement in general in conversational turn taking. It's not just a static property of the classroom, but it varies, and that variability matters. Oops. Okay, so overall, our data revealed the importance of classroom language experiences, especially from peers and especially conversational turn taking from adults, and that both of those contribute to language use and seem to facilitate language development. And our results are significant in their impact of understanding contextual predictors of language gains in both high-risk children from low SES families who might be receiving less than optimal levels of language input at home, and in children with hearing loss who are at risk in general for language delays. I think the application of Lina and UbiSense, these automated measures to record language and movement experiences in the classroom, provide new insight into the dynamics of classroom language interactions. And we see how development can be built moment by moment through these individual activities, individual conversations, and then that scales up and changes and leads to language development over a longer time scale. Okay, so I want to thank teachers and children for their participations and open it up to questions. Yeah.
So I want to just thank you for sharing this information with us, especially since as a clinician, a speech language pathologist, I always tell parents that come to me, in my questionnaire I have, does your child attend preschool or a daycare setting? And a lot of the times, these little ones that come to me first always just have no. And I want to thank you for this because I always tell parents, put them in school, kids learn from each other, they're going to develop so much more language if they come to me. So your project really makes me feel better as a clinician. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions or comments?
Is there any data a single child versus a child who grow with other older brothers and sisters?
So I don't know. So there's very little work on siblings. So as little work as there is on peers in the classroom, there's less work that's been done on what our siblings actually do to contribute to language development. Anecdotally, and clinicians probably can back me up, people feel that younger children talk less than older children, and say, you know, the older child talks for them, and they don't need to talk because the sibling does all the talking. So that's anecdotal. So I don't know if long-term there's benefits in that because they're learning something else socially, or if there's risks to that because of the delay. I'm not quite sure. Do other people have more scientific thoughts about that than I do? I mean, this would suggest that having a peer model at least has benefit. So the same could be said for siblings. Yeah.
From the little bit of the research that I have looked at with siblings, while we do see that the older siblings are talking more and talk for their siblings, I don't believe, though, that at the end of the day, the younger siblings are going to come out impaired for it. right? So the question really becomes, how different do the language levels look like? Are the older kids at a much higher standard score, say for language, versus the younger ones? But just, I think in general, looking at how listening to their peers, even not even knowing what sibling they are in the hierarchy, that peer communication just really expands and builds their language. And like what Christina's saying is just, it's fascinating and fantastic. I love how you were able to combine those two, the UB Sense and the Lina to gather that information. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's providing us with very rich, lots and lots and lots of data. And we haven't even gotten to the piece yet of looking at, so now we know which individual peer they're interacting with, but the next step is then to look at that peer's language ability and maybe see if we weight the amount of time that you spend with them by their language ability, does that predict gains even more to understand, is it just peers in general because they're closer to your level in general, or are some peers more helpful in their input, and to understand those sorts of questions.